Well, hi again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football. I'm Harper LaBelle, along with our producer engineer, Logan Landers. And then we've got our co host and founder, Vincent Turner. And Vincent, today we get the honor in talking in our Legend show about a guy who's got his own nickname. And there are very few people that would argue. Even teammates would say this guy is half man and he's half monster. He's the manster, Randy White. We get to talk about him today. Man, this is going to be a great show.
Cowboy Nation. Been a Cowboys fan since I was 6 years old. Randy White, one of my most favorite players in Cowboy football history. And when you talk about the Cowboys, and you talk about even the great defensive tackles that's played in the National Football League, nobody really talks about how great and how good Randy White was. And nobody talk about how good he was at Maryland. Back to you, Mr. Harper LaBelle.
Well, we will. We're certainly going to honor him today. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on January 15th, 1953. That makes him 71 years old now, just ready to have another birthday coming up here shortly. But he moved to Wilmington, Delaware, and that's where he went to high school, McKeon High School. And he was a fullback and he was a linebacker on defense. And McKeon High School, still to this day, will say the greatest single player that has ever attended this school is Randy White, none other. And he had a great career there. He got plenty of carries as a fullback. He worked on his athleticism. He worked on his ability to run and be endurance driven. And he also, as a defensive player, was a hitter. And he learned how to play from both sides of the ball, which I think made him a better football player in terms of understanding one and the other. But one of the things that impressed me about his high school days is back then, this is talking about the early to mid 70s, there weren't a whole lot of teams or schools that had weight rooms. But Randy used to love lifting weights. He would spend hours in a weight room getting himself stronger. And that would prove to be one of the deciding factors where next to Ed Too Tall Jones and Larry Pugh and Harvey Martin, he looked small comparatively next to these guys. But when you and I would go up next to him and stand, this guy was a monster. He was a big, thick, strong. He looked a little sloppy there. His jersey would get dirtier than others. He always had those elbow pads on when you remember him as a Cowboy. But his high school career was good enough to get him, as Vincent said, to the University of Maryland. And there was a big difference that was made. He went as a fullback and played as a fullback his freshman year. They only won 2 games that freshman year. So Maryland ends up getting a new coach. His name is Jerry Claiborne. And Jerry ends up moving him to the defensive side of the ball on the defensive line. How about that? What a decision and a life-changing one for Randy White. Instead of complaining, Randy just took advantage of the situation. And what a difference that made for him. He used his offensive quickness, his ability to know where a hole was, and to be able to get to it as a runner, to be able to flip that around defensively, to say, know where the hole is, and be able to get there and plug it up before a running back could get through. I think that's one of the big difference makers that made Randy White such an amazing player. But Vincent, let's go talk a little bit about his college before we talk about him being the number 2 pick overall in the draft and going to the Dallas Cowboys.
You mentioned his first year at Maryland, it went 2-9, and Jerry Claiborne, first head coaching job. Remember, Jerry Claiborne was on the staff with Bear Bryant at the University of Alabama one time and another. So Jerry Claiborne back in the day realized that he was going to put Maryland football on the map. He had to have all his good players from an offense standpoint switch them to the defensive side of the ball. And he said the reason he moved Randy White, as you just mentioned, Hart, was his quickness. And when you look at Randy White back then, one thing during that 74 college football season, everybody talked about this guy was the best player in the country. This his instincts were off the charts as a D tackle. He could key and diagnose a play better than any defensive tackle that's played on that level. But what got me, and I watched Maryland that year, 14 years old, 74 Liberty Bowl against the University of Tennessee, was he was so explosive and athletic. And in the Liberty Bowl game that year, he was most MVP as a defensive tackle. You can go back and look at the game film on YouTube. ABC used to do the game. It was the first game of the college football season. That night, 1 sack, 4 tackles for loss, 2 forced fumbles, and he knocked Condrich Holloway out of the game. But it was a gentleman that coached at the 901 University of Memphis, Mr. Tommy West, that's from Gainesville, Georgia, that played at Tennessee under Bill Battle. He was playing tight end that night. And I remember what he said. There's no football player that I ever played against that's better than this man. He said, I could not get him off his feet. I clipped him. I tried to get him high. I tried to get him low. And if you know Tommy West, and I love Tommy, thank you for being the coach down at University of Memphis all those years. He's a guy that's very real in life. And he loves to talk, and he brings a lot of energy to the table. And I sat back and I said, man, I had never really seen a defensive player play at that level, play after play. Because back then we only talked about offensive players. And he finished college career with 147 tackles, 12 sacks, and 24 tackles for loss. And then you think about it, he went into the 75 NFL draft. Brokowski, Peyton, Big Hands Johnson, Russ Francis, Fred Dean. But that's a quiet secret. He might have been the best player in the draft. Back to you, Hawk.
Yeah, he could do it all, couldn't he? Let's look at some of the things that he accomplished while he was at Maryland. Obviously, moving to defensive end was a life changer for him. 1973, he was a first-team All-American. In 74, he was a unanimous All-American. He wins the Outland Trophy, the Lombardi Trophy. He was the MVP player in the Liberty Bowl, as Vincent said, even though they lost that game. Think about that. The team that loses has the best player on the field, but yet everyone still saw it, and they honored him with that. He was the ACC Player of the Year, and he was the number 2 overall pick in 1975. So everything with the Dallas Cowboys didn't start out all rosy for him. He was a linebacker at first. He was there to kind of back up Leroy Jordan, and he had to wait a little while. Into his second year, Leroy Jordan retires, but guess who they gave the job to? Bob Bruning. That doesn't mean they didn't like Randy White. They just didn't think that he was the best middle linebacker. And then Tom Landry made a decision that would change him forevermore, moves him to right defensive tackle. And that's when it all started to take that speed, his ability to understand what to do, especially from a coverage standpoint, and being a member of a linebacker to moving up to the front and realizing how quickly you could do that, and then taking over all those offensive skills that he carried with him from his high school and early college career. Ooh, buddy, he was something else. And again, strong, fast, quick to get. He could go around you, and knowing that he was going to be in the A gap, he would go into the B gap and go around you and then get back in the A gap and clog it up while the offensive linemen are just looking around going, what the heck? I don't know how to block this guy. Just like anybody that goes against him. What a force, and a phenomenal one. Career started taking off there, and everything started changing. His rookie year, they went to the Super Bowl. Can I tell a quick story?
Yes, sir.
Is the team buses at the end of the Super Bowl, and this is Super Bowl 10, the one where Dallas ends up losing to Pittsburgh, and Lynn Swann had those great catches along the sideline and in the end zone. Steelers win. He's a little dejected. He goes to get on the team bus, he and one of his teammates, I think it was Larry Pugh, and there's no room. Because by this time, you've got some of the wives and family members, and he gets off the bus, and there's a taxi cab that's kind of in line, and he gets in the cab. He's got a bag with him, and he gets in the cab next to some long-haired dude, and he just looks around, and he's really distraught. And next thing you know, the long-haired dude looks over at him, and he says, hey, man, you played really well today. I'm a big fan. He looks so – it's Willie Nelson. It's Willie and Waylon and a few of the other guys were a part of the entourage that was rooting for the Cowboys, and they played a big show for the Cowboys after the game was over, and Randy ended up getting up and singing a couple of songs with the guys. So even in some of the bad times, it wasn't so bad. Vincent, let's go a little bit more over your team, America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, and what Randy White meant, not only to have his own nickname, but to be a part of the Doomsday Defense.
Cowboy Nation. When you think about when Randy White stepped into the league, you think about all the great defensive tackles, Bob Lilly, Marilyn Olsen, Buck Buchanan, Alan Page, and I'm even going to put Joe Green in the mix. Randy White was just as good as any of those players. And you think about him being the MVP in the Super Bowl against Denver. 1 sack, 5 tackles, him and Harvey Martin sharing the MVP role, and how dominant he was in that game. But you think about the Cowboys defense back in the day, the Doomsday. Bruning, as you just mentioned, D.D. Lewis, Charlie Waters, Cliff Harris, Benny Barnes, and how easy Randy White made it for Harvey Martin and Ed Too Tall Jones. But when you think about that Doomsday defense, everybody's always going to mention Ed Too Tall Jones and Harvey Martin first. And I was talking to the great Mark Denham the other night, and he said, you know what? Nobody really talks about how great and how good he was. And think about this. He's the only D tackle that's been an MVP in a bowl game, a major bowl game, at the highest level of the Super Bowl. And you're talking about strong. Rumors are he can bench press 450 pounds 10 times. Everything about him was special. Tom Landry called him the most hardest working player from a talent standpoint he ever coached. Jerry Claiborne in Maryland, not to go back, say he was the best player that ever came out of Maryland football history. And just to tell you how athletic Randy White really was, and I hate him for this because it cost me $100. Super Bowl against Pittsburgh, my freshman year. You know, they handed Randy White on the coverage team. Remember that play, Hawk? When Pittsburgh had took the lead 21-17, they kick it to him. He don't know what he gonna do. He should have took it off the field. He tried to level it back. They end up fumbling. Next play, Pittsburgh, Terry Bradshaw goes deep to Lynn Swan, who pulls it out of the air. Game over, and the terrible towels, and I got to give up $100. That's the only part I don't like about Randy White. But think about how athletic that is, Hawk. He was on the kickoff team. The kickoff team as a blocker, defensive tackle. You being mean.
I got your $100 for you right here. We'll get a loan. We'll get a loan from Randy to get that back to you. But I do remember that play, and
man,
Smith and some of the other things that happened. Go ahead, Vincent. I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
He had a broken cast that day. He played in that game with a broken cast. But when I said you talking about one of the greatest Dallas Cowboys football players ever, played 15 seasons in the league, he had a very quiet, great career. I'm gonna leave it at that. One of the greatest Cowboys ever. And just after his playing days, there's a lot of people I know close to the Cowboys organization. One, Mr. James Bear Maryland, whose son Russell played with the Cowboys, said Randy White is one of the most classiest acts that he's ever met associated with the Dallas Cowboys football history. Ed Too Tall Jones loved him. Harvey Martin loved him. Thomas Henderson loved him. And this guy was a very special football player. I just can't get over. He was a defensive tackle playing on the kickoff return team. Back to you, Mr. Harper LaBelle.
Imagine being a wedge buster on any
That's what I'm saying.
And you got to run into that guy. You're going to basically lose 2 inches from your total size, and your neck is going to bother you for years. He did an interview that I got to read where the interviewer was asking him about those great teams, the Super Bowl 10 and 13 teams, and both were losses to the Steelers. And if he says, if we won either one of those games, and I know, Vincent, you want to win the second one because that was where the $100 was on the line.
Absolutely.
He goes, we'd have Harvey, Too Tall, Larry Cole, everybody would be in the Hall of Fame. Everyone, because all of the Steelers ended up winning both of those. Any of their great players is already in the Hall of Fame, and there's still quite a few Cowboys that were left out. You mentioned D.D. Lewis or Bob Bruning. Just the difference one of those two would have made to the history of the Cowboy organization. Not that he's complaining, just saying that it would have been a different outcome. My one story is from Dave Scott, the former guard, one of the big 300-pound guards, one of the first ones that ended up making it. A lot of guys, when they were that big and heavy, didn't get to play in the league for very long because they couldn't move. But Dave Scott from the University of Kansas could, and he was on a part of that that offensive line when the Falcons made the playoffs their first year in 1980. First time they had made the playoffs, excuse me. It wasn't their first year in existence. And Steve Bartkowski, and offensive line was Van Note, Mike Ken, Scott. You had R.C. Thielman. There were some good guys that played in that era. And there's one play where they need a third down, and it's in the fourth quarter. It's third down. They need to gain 2 yards to get the first down. And it's the play where Too Tall Jones ends up tiptoeing. The call all game long had been on 1, and then they go on 2 on this one, and Ed leaves a little early, and he's tiptoeing like Fred Flintstone on his toes down the line of scrimmage. And Dave said the best block he ever had in his life was against Randy White on that play, and he moved him back 5 yards, and there was a gigantic hole. But because of the play timing and everything, Too Tall ends up going in there. Lynn Kane can't block him, and William Andrews gets stuck at the line of scrimmage. They end up punting. The Cowboys end up winning that game. But that's just one of those little things that happen in a game, and especially with Randy White and everybody's respect for him. That's the moral of the story, is that, man, I got a great block. I got at least one in my career against that guy. That makes my career sufficient to be able to do that and go against him and lose so many times throughout your career against a guy like that. But Randy, if you want to look at some of his accomplishments, 14 years in the NFL. He played in 3 Super Bowls. He was a champion in 1. He was a co-MVP in that very same one against the Denver Broncos in 1979. And the Cowboys just dominated that game. Vincent, before I give my perspective on final stats and everything with him, anything else that you want to say about Randy?
My final thoughts about Randy White is that outstanding representative of the Dallas Cowboy football nation, and it's just like the great Jim Croce. Bad Leroy Brown, south side of Chicago. You think about Randy White, you need to think about bad man that arrived in Dallas, Texas in 1975. That's all I have to say. Back to you, Mr. Harper LaBelle.
Second pick overall in 1975 out of the University of Maryland. He played with the Dallas Cowboys until 1988. He was a Super Bowl champion. He was also the Super Bowl MVP of Super Bowl 12. 7 times he was a first-team All-Pro. 9 times he was selected to the Pro Bowl. He is a part of the 1980s All-Decade Team, the NFL 100th Anniversary All-Time Team. He is a Pro Football Writers Association All-Rookie in 1975. He is in the Dallas Cowboys Ring of Honor. He won the Lombardi Award, the Outland Award, the UPI Lineman of the Year in 1974, and he was a unanimous All-American that year. He was a first-team All-American in 1973. He was the first-team All-ACC player in 1973 and 74. In his 14 years, he had over 1,104 tackles. He had 111 sacks. He had 1 interception in his career, and he was voted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the College Football Hall of Fame. So we honor Randy White with a fantastic career, an amazing human being. People that love him know that he's just as true as can be. He lets his work do the talking for him, and he is certainly one of the legends that we want to honor here on 100 Yards of Football. So for Vincent Turner, for our producer, Logan Landers, I'm Harper LaBelle saying thank you for tuning in to another episode of our Legend Show. We hope you have a happy new year, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of your day.